Okay. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's program entitled Exploring 18th Century Westchester Through Inventories. It's by Field Horne. So Field Horne is a historian who worked as a research assistant with Sleepy Hollow Restorations, among several other places. He's written several books entitled Westchester County: A History, The Greene County Catskills: A History, and Saratoga Springs: A Centennial History. This program, it's co-sponsored by the Yonkers Historical Society. I just wanted to announce that the Yonkers Historical Society is running an auction right now, and I can post the information about the auction. It's going to be till tomorrow. Tomorrow's the last day, so I'll post a link to the auction in the chat box. It's all virtual. So I look forward to hearing what Field Horne has to say tonight. He's a very interesting and knowledgeable historian. So with that, I'll give the program to you, Field.
Thank you, Michael. Household inventories are an extraordinarily rich source for the study of social history and for material culture studies. While the historians of decorative arts have made good use of them for decades, others began to recognize their value in the 1970s with the development of what is called the new social history and of scholarship on material culture as a whole. A group of scholars at Notre Dame entered the inventories of colonial Essex County, Massachusetts, into a computer format, and Margaret Schiffer self-published her study on Chester County, Pennsylvania. In 1977, a small study was produced for internal use at Sleepy Hollow Restorations, now historic Hudson Valley, covering the small number of Westchester County inventories which survive up to the year 1795. The work was performed in order to illuminate issues of commonplace activities and everyday life which were then demanding our attention. The process of interpretation in living historical farms, of which Phillipsburg Manor was then an example, has become increasingly concerned with conveying to the visitor some of the subtleties of past societies. We asked ourselves such questions as these. What farm animals were typically raised in Westchester County? Were people engaged in agriculture and a trade simultaneously? Of what materials were the utensils for cooking and serving food? What sorts of bedding and bed coverings were used? While there are other records and artifacts which can help answer these questions, no other source can provide as much detail or as large a quantitative sample as can inventories. This point was recognized by Nancy Campbell, then Director of Interpretation and Education at Sleepy Hollow, and my supervisor. It is to her credit that the study was undertaken. I spent 5 months abstracting 210 inventories onto index cards by category. The data on the cards was transferred to pre-numbered forms on which each inventory was sequentially numbered, and finally it was typed into a condensed format. Unfortunately, while computer technology was then coming into use by historians, this is 36 years ago, remember, it was not readily available to us, and the size of the sample encouraged us to perform manual tabulation. In returning to the work now, I find that we would not only have completed the project in far less time, but that further analysis would be much easier. For example, rearrangement of subgroups such as pot, iron pot, broken pot, and cooking pot, to provide overall totals that can only be done otherwise with painful slowness. Perhaps this point was recognized by a clerk in the surrogates court in White Plains back in 1977. She was apparently serving a life sentence, for I had encountered her since 1961 or earlier, and she clearly disliked old records. Her approach was a common one, I found, when requesting an obscure document. I was often told that it didn't exist. When I produced the index entry, I was told it couldn't be found. When I insisted that a search be made, I was simply told it wouldn't tell me anything I needed to know. But an assistant and I established good rapport with her, and after months at the work table in the record room, we felt we should express our thanks. We requested a year's pass to the restorations for her, and she seemed quite pleased, but we didn't realize what her real opinion was. At that time, I was sharing a house on the Hudson in Scarborough with an attorney in that court, and he happened to overhear the clerk's comments. A young woman in the office asked our friend why she alone had been given the gift pass, and she replied, "Well, I help him a lot. The poor man, he has the most boring job. All day long, he sits in our room counting chickens and hogs, chickens and hogs." And I suppose that's what we should do today, because none of us knows very much about the ordinary people of colonial Westchester County. According to Alice Hanson Jones in her 1977 study, American Colonial Wealth Documents and Sources, the principal reason for making an inventory was to prevent dissipation of portable or movable wealth before creditors had been paid their just claims. A second reason was probably to assign to the widow and other heirs their proper shares. Thus, an inventory is one of the three major probate documents, along with the will, the decedent's own wishes, and the accounting, which records the disposition of the assets and the settling of claims. For our purposes, the first legislation governing the taking of inventories was part of the Duke's Laws of 1665, by which English government was codified in the colony. It required the taking of an inventory and rested jurisdiction for probate in the Court of Sessions. In 1692, a new law placed probate in the hands of the governor himself or his deputy, but permitted the process to take place in the Court of Common Pleas in the remote counties, and then be submitted to the seat of government at New York City. Under state government in 1787, the present system of surrogate courts was established in roughly its present form. These three dramatic changes in the legal process affected our study, unfortunately. In the other 12 colonies, probate rested in town or county and remains there to this day. In New York, it originated, as I said, in the Court of Sessions, was given to the governor, and finally in 1787 was stabilized in the surrogates courts. Thus, it is not surprising that in New York State, we have only a fragmentary group of household inventories. Those for the colonial period were thrown out by the court clerks in this century. Not all of them, but the large part. By this century, I mean the 20th century. A group through 1724 were picked off the curb by a historian and deposited at Queens College, from whence they were sent to the New York State Archives. A group of inventories from 1728 through 1785 were deposited many years ago at the New York Historical Society. These two groups can be only a fraction of those which were taken in probate. From 1787 to the present day, nearly all inventories are in the original order in the office of the surrogate at White Plains, but stored at the Records Center south of Elmsford. Due to the small sample available, we sought any other inventories we could find. We found a few in Historical Society collections and several copied into a library at the New York County Surrogate's office. 6 inventories made for other purposes were included. When Alexander McDonald sold his New Rochelle farm to James Pitcher in 1766, an inventory of goods included was made, and Pitcher later prepared a list of his farming equipment. We found 3 inventories of goods plundered by American troops after the Battle of White Plains in Forces American Archives, a published work, and a list prepared in 1777 when Pierre Van Cortlandt moved from Croton, from the Manor House at Croton, to Amenia in Dutchess County, is in the collection of Historic Hudson Valley. What this indicates is that our sample is small, somewhat erratic, and far less comprehensive than those, for example, of Essex County, Mass. Alice Jones found that the majority of inventories have survived from the colonial period, except in New York, where only a number of 100 inventories survive. Many small estates, despite the law, were not taken to probate court, but the total costs of probate were not so large as to cause avoidance, according to Jones. So far as she has been able to determine, there were no inheritance or estate taxes in the colonial period. Even in colonies where the sample is complete, inventories do not represent the full spectrum of society. While they were required whether or not the decedent made a will, of course you can have an administrator of an intestate estate, and they were not limited to males or to persons of property. Alice Jones found that they were limited in effect to free persons. They were seldom made for children or non-whites, and they were made for most cases which entered the probate system. Relatively few women's estates appear. Limited as we are by the technology or lack of it used in 1977, we cannot develop any complex analyses of economic issues or structures. What we can do, however, is determine what goods were in use and something about their quality and distribution. In 94 single-spaced pages, tabulating by number which inventories include any given item, only a small number of objects are in widespread distribution. In no case, however, does an object appear in every inventory. To determine what level constituted virtually universal distribution, I chose 4 items which common sense suggests were in every home: a table, a chair, a bed, not a bedstead, meaning more like a mattress, and a kettle. In addition, I selected a farm animal which we might expect would be most common, the milk cow, excluding those being raised or held for beef or draft use. Now, there is a caveat here because under state law, after 1787, there were provisions for the widow to retain certain basic goods, like a table, a chair, a bed, or a kettle. But it does appear as though the majority of estates had these few goods. In each of these 5 cases, the frequency of appearance lies between 63 and 75%. In fact, only the kettle appears in as few as 63%. Between 73 and 75% of the households inventoried a table, a chair, and a bed. This is a surprisingly small range, and it's complemented by the appearance of dairy cattle in the same ratio of households, 75%, though we might have suspected that fewer households than listed the most basic furnishings would have kept a cow. The margin for error, therefore, is fairly high. Only about 3/4 of the inventories include the most essential of goods. When we go on to evaluate the presence of other things, we will have to assume that a 37% frequency suggests, in the roughest terms, the presence of that object in half of the households of that place and time. The ownership of land cannot be analyzed from these documents. Although land was always inventoried in New England, it was omitted from the inventories in the other colonies. Only 17% of our sample include land, and this includes 9 of the surviving 17th century inventories, which are, it's a very small part of the total. Only 8 of our pre-revolutionary decedents were listed as residents of Phillipsburg, but 13 of our post-revolutionary sample listed improvements on farms, meaning improvements to farms they did not own. And of these, 11 were Phillipsburg residents. The presence of improvements in an inventory is evidence but not proof of tenancy. For example, when Caleb Archer died owning improvements in 1790, the appraiser was either listing them out of habit or Archer had become a tenant to a new landlord speculator. In the absence of data on land ownership, the animals of the farm were a major aspect of wealth. As already stated, 75% of the households owned dairy cows. between 1 and 7 cows each, although Caleb Hyatt had 11 cows when he died at White Plains in 1776. And with calves and heifers, the total stock of cattle was usually somewhat greater. About 40% of the households owned sheep, and in much larger numbers than cows. William Richardson, who died at Westchester town, which is now the southeastern Bronx, in 1693, had 116 sheep and lambs, but flocks of several dozen were common within this sample. Most of the households owned one or more commonly several horses. About 53 of the households owned swine, often half a dozen or a dozen, but ranging up to 33. The collective term swine is little used after the Revolution, when they itemized cows, hogs, shoats, pigs, and in one case, a barrow. Poultry appears in few inventories, though Noah Bishop of Morrisania, now the central Bronx, must have been supplying eggs to the city when he died in 1788, owning 90 chickens. Only 9% of the inventories list poultry, hens, chickens, or fowl, sometimes listed as dunghill fowl, while 10% list geese. One farm had 9 ducks and 3 farms had turkeys. We should question whether the frequency is affected by tradition, assigning ownership of chickens to women. Perhaps that is why geese outnumber chickens in the sample of 10% to 9%. It's worth noting that in no inventory does even a single goat appear. Bees are listed in only 2 inventories, but 10% of the households have hives and 8% skips, meaning skeps, S-K-E-P-S, a kind of hive made of straw. Traditionally, a hive is a wooden box. And while the presence of pets is somewhat out of place in a discussion of husbandry, it's worth noting that the pair of brown stags in Joseph Lockwood's 1789 Pound Ridge list, a cur dog and some bloodhounds on Pleasant just after the sales of confiscated farms in 1785, and 3 cosset or pet sheep owned by Elvin Ferris of Westchester town. There is no mention of cats, but this is no surprise since they are almost never mentioned in colonial documents. The distribution of the tools of cultivation and agriculture generally is somewhat less consistent than of, say, dairy cattle. Most of the households owned a plow, a fork, a hoe, and a spade. Less frequently, we find cradles, fans, harrows, rakes, shovels, sieves, and yokes for horses or for oxen. Only 2 inventories list flails. For those who don't know farming, a flail is a tool that you use to beat the chaff from the grain. And both those flail inventories were mid-century. A mattock, M-A-T-T-O-C-K, already obsolete, appears in 1679. And there are 2 billhooks in one list. These are ancient tools that were passing out of use in the early colonial period. And that short list completes the range of implements which appear to have been in use on our farms. However, considerable differentiation among the tools can be noted in the inventories. The language used to describe plows renders quantification difficult, for they are described as plows with shares, and so on. 5 post-war inventories list a Dutch plow. That is a wheeled plow. They're all owned by persons of English origin in New England settled towns on the eastern side of the county. But this is probably an incomplete count since no such description appears in the Dutch settled region. In other words, in the Dutch inventories, they may have simply called it a plow when it was in fact a Dutch plow. Tackling is often listed and sometimes specified as a coulter, a clevis, and the like. Among the common implements, about 35% of the households owned a pitchfork or hayfork, or just a fork. We know its purpose by its location among farm tools in the list rather than in the kitchen. And about 9% had a dung fork. About 40% owned a hoe, or more commonly, two hoes. Some hoes were described as broad hoes or stubbing hoes, though less frequently so in the later period. A few hoes appear for use in bogs or gardens. About 22% of the lists include a spade, though some of these may have been called shovels. Scythes appear in about 37% of the lists, some with tackling or with a cradle. The earliest cradle appears in Gilbert Hunt's 1754 inventory, and they are predominantly post-revolution. To explain again, for those who don't know historic farming, a scythe is probably fairly well known. It's a long blade on a handle that you sweep close to the ground. A cradle is a forked attachment underneath the blade onto which the grain or the grass can fall so that it can be dropped on the ground in a more orderly manner. In a small number of inventories, fans are listed, and this means a device for creating a wind to separate wheat from chaff. And 5 fanning mills are found in the final decade of our sample, all 5 belonging to former Phillipsburg tenants. This can be quite a large, excuse me, quite a large implement, about the size of a stove with a handle on it to create the wind. 12% of the sample owned a harrow, some of which, being a better quality, are described as iron-toothed. A few rakes are present, mostly in multiples, though of the 18 households having 1 or more rakes, 3 owned only a single garden rake. One of these was Edward Cohenhoven, a Tarrytown shopkeeper. A number of households owned sieves, sifts, riddles, and screens of various kinds and of various materials, including brass wire, hair, splint, and punch. 18% had either an ox yoke or a horse yoke or both. 13% owned a sickle, which is essentially a short scythe. Some of the people owning sickles owned scythes as well, but others did not. The major crops inventoried in most cases, while foodstuffs for domestic use are an exception in the lists. Westchester County in the 18th century was an important grain producer, and wheat is by far the most prevalent, occurring in 26% of the lists, either on the ground, in shocks, stacks, barrack, or barn. A barrack is an open-sided storage device with poles at 4 corners and a peaked roof. It will, of course, be missing from any estate after the sale of harvest in the fall or before the next planting. Given our knowledge of the Hessian fly, a parasite that appeared in the 1780s, it's not surprising that wheat appears far less commonly after mid-decade. Rye and corn were also important grain crops and continue their rate through the period. Oats appear more frequently before the war than afterward, while buckwheat, promoted by the new agriculture of mid-century, is first listed in 1738 and becomes more prevalent after the war. Barley is present, but not common. Barley is a particularly Scottish grain. Oats often appears more frequently in Scottish households. Westchester was not a heavily Scottish county. The irresponsible Anglican rector of Rye, who died in 1708, had 35 pounds of rice, but this was, of course, a luxury. Salted, smoked, and pickled meat, more pork than beef, with mutton never specified by name, appears in moderate quantities, although the 57 barrels left by John Haviland of Rye in 1757 suggests the processing and shipping of pork on the Sound. The common man's drink of the colonies, cider, was stored in about 11% of the households inventoried. One shopkeeper and one farmer owned some metheglin, an alcoholic beverage made from honey, and smaller amounts of brandy, cider beer, gin, rum, and wine are found. Butter and cheese were, of course, the form in which dairy products were shipped for sale, and they appear in a small number of lists. And the 43 pounds of butter stolen from John Martine of Phillipsburg during the war, and the 26 cheeses left by Joseph Costin of Westchester in 1789 were probably intended for shipment. Cheeses could be shipped quite a long distance. Butter, not so far, but Westchester was close enough to Manhattan to tap the market for butter in the big city. Nearly half of all estates had a churn, and almost always a single churn. About 5% had a cheese press, though the dairy furniture or milk room contents may conceal a few additional presses. Potatoes and peas were common field crops, but appear only in 4% and 1% rates respectively. While with the exception of salt, all other foodstuffs are listed very infrequently. We do find that William LeConte, a New Rochelle cooper, had 530 pounds of coffee in 1759, which certainly suggests he was a shopkeeper as well as a cooper. And we will probably never know why Israel Honeywell's appraiser thought it necessary to list half a squash in the shed. I mean, that really is weird. Beyond the tools and products of agriculture, which, while not universal, were in fact very nearly so, there are tools and products listed in the inventories which demonstrate that their owners practiced trades, often in addition to farming. Francis Yates, who died at Westchester town in 1682, listed tinker's tools, though they are unfortunately not itemized. The limited supply of imported tin plate until well after the Revolution made his a rare trade. 2 men left blacksmith's tools. About 8% of the inventories listed carpenter's tools, and the presence of extensive sets of tools listed separately suggests that somewhat more than 8% of the men who died, leaving sufficient goods to be inventoried, must have practiced carpentry at least part-time or part of their lives. 10% of the households had looms. A very few of these were called weaver's looms, so the size or potential product may have differentiated them, and some may have been used only for household production. Jean Méchet of New Rochelle in 1700, and he would have been French speaking, was a shipbuilder. He was so described in the inventory, and he left a ship upon the stocks, as well as a half share and a sloop at sea. 6 other men owned sloops or half shares. Daniel Martling, a Tarrytown boatman who died in 1788, left a sloop of 135 tons burthened, called the Union, and a petty auger known as the Lady Washington. Francis Bloodgood of Phillipsburg left a ferry boat at his death in 1746 that would have probably crossed the river at either Yonkers, Dobbs Ferry, Tarrytown, or what is now Ossining. Cooperage was certainly an important trade, even if we judge it solely on the vast quantity of vessels, empty and full, which are listed in all sizes and styles, down to a few tiny runlets and tierces. Based on ownership of tools and materials, we might judge that at least 2, but perhaps 4 or more of the decedents were coopers. When Daniel Baker of Phillipsburg died about 1784, he left a cooper's vise, a quantity of staves and headings, truss hoops and iron hoops, a cresset, a crows, 2 howls, and a cooper's adze. Joseph Geyer of Pound Ridge was a shopkeeper, but he died owning 550 staves, apparently taken in trade. Only a few estates included fishing implements. None of the decedents appears to have made a living by it, though certainly there were a number of fishermen both on river and sound. About 5 nets appear, along with a seine, an oyster rake, and an eel spear. 4% of the inventories include shoemaker's tools, not surprisingly, since this was a common winter trade for many, many farmers. A few men are revealed as tanners or curriers. Solomon Haynes of Cortland owned rope-making tools. Thus far, we have discussed the business of making a living as revealed by inventories, but they certainly tell us a great deal about domestic arrangements as well. Some few list the contents of a house room by room, and taken individually or as a group, they can provide unusual information. They are so rare, however, in our sample as to be without statistical use, except to clarify the purpose of an item such as a fork, which might be used in kitchen or in barn. In our quantitative tabulation, we find that 3/4 of the sample lists at least one chair. In one case, 2.5 dozen are included. The description includes clues as to material, style, and function. They were made of mahogany and black walnut, among other woods, and seated with cane and with leather in a few cases. They were painted black, red, and green, and made in banisterback, fiddleback, slatback, and Windsor styles. There were a few fashion chairs and there were a few wing fashion chairs and 2 easy chairs. Of tables which were equally widespread, we can learn somewhat less. Again, materials may be specified: oak, mahogany, black walnut, bilstead, whitewood, and white cherry. They are described by shape as round, oval, or square, by function for kitchen, dining, or tea, and for special uses such as backgammon, dressing, or placement in a corner. Next to tables and chairs, the commonest daytime pieces were chests and cupboards. Some of the chests or cases were actually chests of drawers, or chests with one or more drawers. Cupboards are mostly unspecified, but a few were for clothes or referred to as cupboard racks or rack cupboards, apparently having open display. Over 50% of the inventories include looking glasses, so that the fake lore about colonial Americans being without mirrors should probably be laid to rest. 25% of the households owned a desk. And remember, we're roughly doubling the percentages to get a likely return. Other less common pieces of furniture included benches, bookcases, buffets, spelled as though they were pronounced beaufats, clocks in 5% of the lists, 2 couches, pictures in 5% of the lists, stands, and a single clothes stool. In other words, a night pot stool. None of these appear with a frequency which is statistically significant. While some of the pieces with English persons' names may have been Costin, none can be positively identified as such. A slawbank, however, appears 5 times, 4 of them early in the century in English households in Eastchester or Westchester. Both towns had very, very few Dutch residents, maybe if any. A slawbank is a built-in sleeping cupboard. Daniel Martling at Tarrytown had one at Tarrytown repeated myself there, in 1788. Edward Cohenhoven owned a board bunk, which is probably the same thing. It's possible that these are underestimated due to their integral relationship with the house itself. Beds, bedsteads, and beddings are present in large quantities throughout the inventories. The term mattress appears only once. Bed appears to be the common designation. Typically, the bed furniture consisted of a bedstead, bed cords for support, and the bed, a feather bed, blankets, coverlets, and a few bedspreads, bed rugs, and quilts to provide warmth. Bolsters and pillows, apparently used together, though the bolster seldom had a case, while the pillow often did. Curtains, testers, and valances appear in modest numbers for use on the beds. Heating was a universal need, but again, not every inventory contains the necessities for it. Andirons are present in about 43% of the lists. Other fireplace equipment in common use were bellows, shovels, tongs, and in smaller numbers, warming pans. About 67% of the households, and remember that's a very high number, had trammels. A trammel is a device that allows you to raise or lower a pot using notches and a loop that can engage. They were hung in the fireplace. And many households had two. However, the word crane does not appear in any of the inventories. While it was, in a sense, built into the house, it seems to have been a late development and may, in fact, not have been used locally in the 18th century. Cooking equipment is somewhat predictable. Kettles made of brass, iron, copper, or tin are present in 63% of the lists. Iron pots for cooking are in about 52%, although 63% is probably more realistic if we include unspecified pots, some of which may be earthen, for storage. Gridirons and griddles, frying pans and skillets, some of which are present together in the same household, are fairly numerous, along with tea kettles and trays, funnels or tunnels, ladles, pans, pie pans, skimmers, toasters, and toasting irons are also present. Rarely we find a lime squeezer, a waffle iron, a rolling pin, a mortar, a grater, and a colander. Only 3 households owned a tin oven, which could be placed in front of the fire. And Edward Cohenhoven had the only Dutch oven, in other words, a cast pot with a lid to hold coals. Well, while we consider the looms, at least as a group, to represent the men's trades, the frequency of textile working equipment used by women attests to its importance and also reminds us that women's goods were her husband's property at this time. Spinning wheels of some kind, and frequently of several kinds, are present in 56% of the households. Linen wheels, also called little, small, or Dutch wheels, are slightly more prevalent than wool wheels, which may be referred to as great, big, or large wheels. For use in producing yarns, a fair number of households also own a reel or a swift. The raw materials and the tools for processing them are commonly present. 22% of the lists include unprocessed flax, and 28% owned at least one hatchel. A smaller number owned what we are accustomed to call a break, to break the outer layer of flax, but which seems to have been known as a crackle. In one instance, fortunately, it was listed as a crackle break, and elsewhere as a flax crackle, so the identification seems fairly secure. The amount of woolworking is suggested by the large numbers of sheep, but we also find a fair amount of unprocessed wool, along with sheep shears and wool cards in about 11 or 12% of the households, but they are not always present together. Of course, basins, wash tubs, whiting pots, and sad irons are fairly common. Irons appear in 36% of the households, generally in pairs. But other items are strangely rare. Only 3 inventories list brooms, though this may be because they had so little intrinsic value. Why, though, are there only 2 bathtubs, both in rye and both in the 1760s? And chamber pots, at least so-called, appear in only 4% of the lists. Perhaps some such items were just designated pots and can potentially confuse us as being cookware. Candlesticks are fairly common, and a household often owned 2 or 3, but seldom more than 3. They are made of brass, iron, pewter, or tin. There are a few sconces, but not a statistically significant number. And lanterns, always spelled lanthorn, are in 13% of the inventories. Only Charles Meade of Cortland, 1772, and Daniel Devoe of Yonkers, 1784, owned lamps. There are many more topics which might be explored through the existing sample of inventories, despite its technological limitations, including clothing and other personal gear, the types of textiles available, equipment for food service, slaves or servants, and the numbers and titles of books though specifics are more limited in that category than we might wish. If we are to truly study material culture or social history successfully, we will need a larger sample from New York Colony, perhaps including the 3 other lower Hudson Valley counties. The sample available at present is rather small to develop any hard conclusions. Certainly the lack of computer capability at that time limited what could be done in the way of analysis. We have made at least a beginning, and if nothing else, the data now available suggests new questions which might otherwise not have been asked. And specific cases are always fun to examine. If you wonder whether there was any friction between the tenant farmers and those of higher status, you need only examine a case from Rye, where the hardworking farmers were mostly freeholders. There in 1784, the Reverend Thomas Pritchard arrived from England to serve as rector of the Anglican Church. By the time he died a year later, he had married Anna Stuyvesant, granddaughter of Old Peter, infuriated his parishioners by making his home at a New Rochelle inn and rarely setting foot in Rye. And from the contents of his inventory, we might suspect irritating people by his lifestyle. A single entry therein reads as follows. An East India box in case of wood, about 7 inches square, contain in the India box 4 little boxes, India make, in 3 inches square each. In one box, a small gold chain and a locket of 9 diamond sparks set in enamel. In another box, 2 gold small rings, about 30 shillings value, 2 crystal pendants set in gold, garnished with gold wire, about 3 pieces of 8 value, 8 small sets of gold for 2 pearls each, for pearls wanting, 2 pieces of 8 value, 2 crystals cut for ear pendant of 8 value. In the last box, 5 pearls, brute in polish, and an old pearl at 3 pound value. More, a silver whistle, 7 bells, and sisal. 1 silver chain and clasp for keys, about 3 pieces of 8 value. 1 silver bodkin, 1/2 piece of 8, 1 East India agate, little better, with a top of silver and a small chain, about 3 pennyweight. Silver the better, as big as the top of a thumb, about 2 yards of 8 bond, with silver edge ribbon, 8 penny broad yard, 1/2 scarlet ribbon, 8 penny broad yard, silver ribbon, penny broad, 2 bits of towny ribbon, 12 penny broad, a little purse of silk, a thumb bigness, a small magnifying glass. All this in conjunction with what must have been the only pair of women's falsies then in use in Rye suggests a rather flamboyant households. Far more typical and far more important to our understanding of life in the 18th century are the rich, somewhat puzzling lists of farm tools, household goods, and the occasional lot of old trumpery, which make up the record of the agrarian material culture of colonial Westchester County. Thank you.
Thank you, Field. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Yes.
The question from Char Weigel. The first question is no, it has never been published. And I have possibly the only copy. And the second question, no, I don't remember monkey spoons, but I would have to go to the 75-page tabulation rather than to my paper.
Field, can I ask a question?
Yes, Phyllis.
I was curious, the way you described it, it seemed to be quite a calm social order. Was there at some point in those 50 years, let's say, an upheaval, a break in the common day-to-day life? Was there some event that might have stopped people? I am ignorant of that period, so I would like any information.
Stop them from accumulating more goods, do you mean, Phyllis?
Yes, and
Yeah.
interrupting their quite comfortable, ordered, organized life.
Absolutely. There was a minor upheaval, I think it was in 1766, with a rent revolt in a couple of the tracts of land, notably the eastern part of in Cortlandt Manor, which is now Somers, New York, and maybe other towns nearby. It was pretty dramatic, but it was brief. So I don't think that's, I think what you're referring to would be the Revolutionary War, which occurred near the end of the period we studied, but at the time when inventories were becoming much more common. And that was described, as you might read in my Westchester County book, it was described as a period of great devastation in most of Westchester County. It really destroyed the county. I mean, it's actually surprising that people pulled their houses and farms back together again between, say, 1783 and 87 or 88, but they did somehow.
Thank you.
And I have another question. Personal inventories for people that lived in Yonkers in the first 3 decades of the last century. I have never worked with a body of them in the 20th century. I've used individual ones. They should be individually filed in the files at the Record Center at Elmsford. You're dealing with a massive increase in the number of estates. And if you were interested in Yonkers, you would somehow have to go through the files pulling Yonkers. I suspect that for that 30-year period, the number of Yonkers estates would be too large to sample. Well, not to sample, to tabulate in any way. You could certainly sample it. And they're wonderful documents, honestly. They're just fantastic. Any other questions? I thank you so much for your interest in this. And I think that I will talk to Westchester County Historical Society about whether it should be updated and revised and published at some point. A little long for an article, but maybe a two-unit article. And thank you, Michael, for asking me to take part.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking. It was really interesting. Thanks everyone for coming.
Okay.
Yeah, any questions? Otherwise, we'll just close.
Michael knows where to track me down, right?
Yeah, so you can forward me any questions and then I'll send them to Field. If anyone has any questions, I'll write my email.
Absolutely. I'd be glad to do further answers. Signing off. Thank you all.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.